Hunter Brooks walked into the boardroom wearing nothing but a worn old coat and carrying an envelope yellowed by the passing years. Across the table, the young billionaire Grace Whitmore coldly slid a check for $1 million toward him, demanding his silence forever about her late father's secret. Everyone assumed a struggling single father would snatch the money without hesitation. Instead, Hunter only smiled, then opened the old letter written 15 years earlier. As each line came into view, the entire leadership team in that gleaming tower began to unravel, their carefully guarded composure visibly falling apart at last. Stay with us until the end to discover the secret inside that letter which nearly toppled a billion-dollar empire. Hunter Brooks had spent years living a quiet life, far removed from the glass towers and marble lobbies where he once walked with purpose. He worked now as an archive manager in a modest records facility on the edge of the city, cataloging forgotten files for a company that barely knew his name. Few of his co-workers realized he had once served as senior legal counsel inside Whitmore Capital, one of the most powerful investment firms in the country. Fewer still knew why he had vanished from that world so suddenly, without warning, without a farewell, and without any explanation that satisfied the people who had once called him a friend. The envelope that arrived on a gray Tuesday morning changed everything. It bore the crimson seal of Whitmore Capital, embossed with the same insignia Hunter remembered from countless board meetings, and it summoned him to headquarters for what it vaguely called a matter of legacy importance. He almost tossed it aside, believing it to be some clerical mistake, yet something about the phrasing made his chest tighten with an old, familiar unease. He folded the letter carefully and placed it inside his coat pocket, next to another envelope he had carried for far longer than anyone could have guessed. When Hunter stepped into the towering headquarters the following week, the receptionist barely glanced at him before waving him toward the elevator, her expression polite but distant, the kind reserved for visitors who did not belong. The boardroom upstairs gleamed with polished chrome and imported marble, a temple built entirely to intimidate. Around the long table sat men and women in tailored suits, their watches worth more than Hunter's entire monthly salary, their eyes flicking toward his weathered coat with barely concealed disdain. Connor Blake, the chief financial officer, leaned back in his leather chair and allowed a thin smile to spread across his face. He remarked, loud enough for the whole room to hear, that it seemed the archives department had sent someone to collect old furniture rather than attend a serious meeting. A ripple of quiet laughter followed his remark, the kind of laughter designed to remind a man exactly where he stood in the hierarchy of power. Hunter said nothing. He simply took the empty seat offered to him and folded his hands calmly atop the table. Then Grace Whitmore entered the room, and the laughter died instantly. She carried herself with the practiced composure of someone who had inherited an empire before she was ready for its weight, her expression unreadable, her posture rigid with control. She did not sit. Instead, she remained standing at the head of the table, studying Hunter with an intensity that suggested she had rehearsed this moment many times in her mind, uncertain until now how it would actually feel. Without preamble, Grace slid a single sheet of paper across the polished surface, followed by a check bearing an amount most people would never see in a lifetime. $1 million, she explained flatly, in exchange for his permanent silence regarding certain matters concerning her late father. She wanted no further contact, no lingering questions, and no complications as the company prepared for an international public offering that could not tolerate even a hint of scandal. Every person at that table expected Hunter to reach eagerly for the check, to sign whatever document was placed before him, grateful for a sum that could transform the modest life he now led. Instead, Hunter remained still, his gaze steady on Grace rather than the money. He reached slowly into his coat pocket, and the room seemed to hold its breath collectively as he withdrew an old envelope, its edges softened by time, its surface yellowed like something preserved from another era entirely. He placed it gently on the table beside the check, saying nothing at first, allowing the silence itself to become a kind of statement. Grace stared at the envelope, as though she recognized something in its handwriting, even from a distance, her composure flickering for the briefest moment before she regained control. She asked him directly what it contained, her voice sharper now, edged with something between curiosity and fear. Hunter looked at her for a long moment before answering quietly that it held something her father had wanted her to read, only when the proper time finally arrived. He said he believed that time had come. Around the table, several executives exchanged uneasy glances, sensing that whatever calm authority they believed they held in that room was already beginning to slip away from them entirely. 15 years earlier, Hunter Brooks had arrived at Whitmore Capital as a young associate barely out of law school, hungry to prove himself in a firm known for chewing up idealists and spitting out cynics. He carried none of the polish that seemed to define his colleagues. No family connections, no inherited wealth, only a stubborn insistence on doing things properly even when properly was inconvenient. Most executives dismissed him as naive. Sebastian Whitmore, the founder himself, noticed something else entirely. Sebastian was a man who had built his empire from nothing, and he possessed an instinct for character that no business degree could teach. He began quietly testing Hunter with small tasks that seemed unimportant on the surface, watching closely how the young associate handled discrepancies in minor contracts or unexplained gaps in departmental budgets. Time and again, Hunter flagged irregularities that others preferred to overlook, choosing honesty over convenience even when it made him unpopular among colleagues eager to look the other way. On one occasion, Hunter discovered that a mid-level manager had been quietly siphoning funds through a shell arrangement disguised as consulting fees. Rather than bury the finding to avoid conflict, he brought it directly to Sebastian, fully aware that doing so might cost him the goodwill of powerful people. Sebastian listened without interrupting, then thanked him with a firmness that suggested this was not the first time someone had tried to slip something past him, and it would certainly not be the last. From that point forward, Sebastian began to trust Hunter in ways he trusted almost no one else inside the organization, not even members of his own senior leadership team. He would summon him for private conversations after hours, discussing matters far beyond Hunter's official role, testing his judgment on questions of loyalty, integrity, and the quiet corruptions that tend to accumulate inside institutions built around enormous sums of money. Hunter never fully understood why he had been chosen for such confidence, only that he intended to honor it. Connor Blake, then a rising executive with ambitions far exceeding his current title, watched this growing closeness with mounting resentment. He had spent years cultivating relationships within the firm, learning which favors to trade and which silences to purchase, and he found Hunter's blunt honesty deeply inconvenient to his methods. Where Hunter saw problems requiring correction, Connor saw opportunities requiring careful management, and the philosophical gap between the two men widened steadily with each passing year. One evening, after a particularly long and difficult day involving a contentious audit, Sebastian called Hunter into his private office and handed him a sealed envelope without offering any explanation of its contents. He instructed Hunter to keep it safe, somewhere no one else could access it, and to guard it as though it were the most valuable possession he had ever been entrusted with in his entire career. Hunter asked, naturally, what circumstances would ever require him to open it. Sebastian's expression grew distant then, as though he were looking at something far beyond the walls of his office, something only he could see clearly. He said only that Hunter should open it if the day ever came when someone tried to purchase his silence, when money was offered not to reward him, but to erase him quietly from a story that mattered. At the time, the instructions struck Hunter as strange, even faintly theatrical, the kind of statement a man might make after too many long nights buried in paperwork. He accepted the envelope regardless, tucking it away in a drawer at home where it remained untouched, for what he assumed would be a matter of weeks or perhaps months, nothing more. He had no way of knowing then that Sebastian's words had been chosen with the precision of a man who already suspected exactly how his story would eventually unfold. Sebastian never explained further, and Hunter never pressed him for more detail, sensing that some questions were better left until their answers arrived on their own terms. Looking back later, Hunter would recognize that final conversation as the moment everything afterward had quietly been set into motion, long before anyone in that gleaming tower understood what was coming. Sebastian Whitmore died on an otherwise ordinary morning, collapsing suddenly in his office before anyone realized something was seriously wrong. The official explanation arrived quickly and cleanly, a sudden cardiac event brought on by years of relentless stress, the kind of tragedy that surprised no one who had watched him drive himself mercilessly for decades. The funeral was grand, attended by dignitaries and rival executives alike, all offering condolences that sounded rehearsed even when they were sincere. Hunter attended quietly, standing near the back of the crowded chapel, watching Grace absorb the weight of sudden inheritance with a composure that seemed almost frightening for someone so young. He wanted desperately to believe the official account, yet something about the timing gnawed at him persistently, a nagging instinct honed through years of catching irregularities that others preferred to ignore. Sebastian had seemed unusually alert in their final conversation, sharper than exhaustion typically allowed a man to be. In the days following the funeral, Hunter attempted to raise gentle questions with colleagues about certain financial documents Sebastian had mentioned reviewing shortly before his death. Each inquiry was met with polite deflection, then increasingly cold silence, and finally outright hostility from people who had once considered him a trusted colleague. Connor Blake, now maneuvering rapidly to consolidate influence over financial operations, made it clear through intermediaries that Hunter's continued presence at the firm was neither welcome nor necessary. Grace, still grieving and overwhelmed by the sudden burden of leadership, relied heavily on the senior advisors surrounding her, most of whom assured her that continuity and stability required trusting the very people her father had employed for years. She had no reason then to suspect that some of those advisors were the same individuals her father had privately begun to doubt. Hunter tried once to speak with her directly, only to be redirected by an assistant who insisted she was far too occupied to meet with former staff. Within weeks, Hunter found himself quietly maneuvered out of his position, his responsibilities reassigned under the polite language of corporate restructuring, his access to sensitive files revoked without formal explanation. He recognized the pattern immediately, having witnessed similar maneuvers used against inconvenient employees throughout his years at the firm, yet recognizing it did nothing to stop it from happening to him. Rather than fight a battle he had little evidence to win, Hunter made a deliberate choice to step away entirely, removing himself from the corporate world that had once defined his ambitions. He told himself it was simply time to move on, to build something quieter and more meaningful away from boardrooms and shareholder meetings. Yet he never once considered destroying the envelope Sebastian had entrusted to him, carrying it carefully through every subsequent move, every change in circumstance, every uncertain year that followed. He stored it eventually inside a small fireproof box tucked at the back of a closet, rarely looking at it, never opening it, treating it instead as a kind of quiet promise he intended to keep regardless of how irrelevant it might eventually prove to be. Sometimes, late at night, he wondered whether Sebastian's warning had simply been the anxious imagination of a man near the end of his life, seeing threats that never truly existed. Other nights, he felt certain the opposite was true, that something significant remained buried beneath the polished surface of Whitmore Capital, waiting patiently for the right moment to surface. Either way, he understood instinctively that the envelope was not his to open casually, that its purpose depended entirely on circumstances beyond his control. Circumstances that had not yet arrived but which he suspected, somehow, eventually would. 15 years passed in this manner, Hunter building a modest, steady life far removed from the ambitions that once consumed him, the envelope resting untouched, its secret preserved exactly as Sebastian had left it, waiting for a single moment neither man could have fully anticipated. Back in the present, Grace Whitmore explained the situation with the clipped precision of someone rehearsing a story she did not entirely believe herself. A routine internal review, she said, had recently uncovered records indicating that Hunter Brooks still possessed certain documents originally belonging to her late father, materials that predated her leadership and carried no bearing on current operations. She insisted the matter was purely procedural, a loose end requiring closure before the company moved forward with its long-anticipated international public offering. Connor Blake interjected before Grace could finish, his tone carrying an urgency that seemed disproportionate to something he claimed was trivial. He reminded the room that international regulators would scrutinize every aspect of the company's history during due diligence, and that even the appearance of unresolved internal disputes could jeopardize investor confidence at a critical moment. He pressed Grace repeatedly to finalize the settlement quickly, his eyes darting toward Hunter with an intensity that betrayed far more anxiety than the situation should have warranted. Jason Mercer, the general counsel, slid a formal agreement across the table, its language dense with legal phrasing designed to bind Hunter permanently to silence regarding anything connected to Sebastian Whitmore's final months. The document offered generous compensation alongside strict confidentiality clauses, penalties for disclosure severe enough to financially ruin anyone who dared violate them. Hunter read through it calmly, his expression unreadable, while executives around the table watched anxiously for any sign of hesitation. When Hunter remained silent longer than expected, Grace increased the offer without waiting for a response, raising the amount further, as though sheer financial pressure alone might dissolve whatever resistance he was quietly building. She reminded him, not unkindly, that few people in his current circumstances would refuse such an opportunity, that a struggling single father managing archives for modest wages could transform his entire future with a single signature. Hunter finally spoke, his voice calm and measured despite the mounting tension surrounding him. He asked simply why an old envelope, one containing nothing more than sentimental keepsakes as far as anyone in that room claimed to know, would warrant such an extraordinary sum of money to remain unopened. If the contents were truly worthless, he continued, then surely the company had nothing meaningful to fear from his silence or otherwise. The question landed with unexpected weight, and for several long seconds, nobody in the boardroom offered a response. Connor's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and Jason glanced briefly toward Grace before looking away, his composure faltering just enough to be noticed by anyone paying close attention. Grace herself seemed to hesitate, as though the question had exposed something she had not fully examined within her own reasoning. Margaret Hale, seated quietly near the far end of the table, watched the exchange with an expression that revealed nothing outwardly. Yet her eyes lingered on the old envelope resting in front of Hunter with unmistakable recognition. She had served as Sebastian's personal secretary for decades, privy to countless confidential matters that never reached official records, and something about that particular envelope clearly stirred memories she had long kept carefully guarded. Grace, sensing the shifting atmosphere in the room, attempted to regain control of the conversation by insisting once more that the settlement represented a generous, fair resolution to an unfortunate misunderstanding. Yet her voice lacked the conviction it carried moments earlier, and Hunter noticed immediately that her eyes kept returning to the envelope rather than the check lying beside it. Something in her expression suggested curiosity, beginning to override the careful instructions she had clearly been given by the people surrounding her. Hunter finally broke the silence himself, stating quietly that before any signatures were exchanged, he intended to open the envelope precisely as Sebastian had instructed him to do so many years earlier. He explained that the timing had finally arrived, that someone was, at this very moment, attempting to purchase his silence, exactly the circumstance Sebastian once described with unsettling certainty. Around the table, several executives shifted uncomfortably in their expensive chairs, sensing that whatever fragile control they believed they held over this meeting was rapidly slipping through their fingers. Hunter broke the seal carefully, the aged paper crackling softly beneath his fingers as the entire boardroom fell into a silence so complete that the faint hum of the air conditioning became suddenly, uncomfortably audible. He unfolded the letter with deliberate patience, unhurried by the mounting tension surrounding him, as though he understood instinctively that whatever waited inside deserved to be read exactly as Sebastian had intended, without rush, without interruption. It was not a will, nor any formal legal instrument, as several executives had quietly speculated beforehand. Instead, it was a personal letter, written in Sebastian's own hand, the ink slightly faded but the handwriting unmistakably steady and deliberate. Hunter began reading aloud, his voice carrying clearly across the silent room, each word landing with the weight of a man speaking from beyond his own grave. Sebastian had written that if Hunter was reading these words, it meant the company faced genuine danger, danger he had suspected quietly for months before his death, without ever managing to gather sufficient proof. He described uncovering irregularities suggesting that enormous sums, hundreds of millions in company assets, had been systematically diverted through pathways designed specifically to escape routine scrutiny. He had grown certain someone close to him, someone trusted implicitly by the board, was responsible for orchestrating the scheme. He explained that he lacked concrete evidence at the time of writing, only patterns he recognized from decades spent building and protecting his company, patterns too consistent to dismiss as coincidence. Rather than risk confronting the culprit prematurely and losing whatever evidence might eventually surface, he had chosen instead to leave behind a trail meant only for someone he trusted absolutely, someone whose integrity he had tested repeatedly and never once found wanting. The letter continued with a list of individuals Sebastian believed warranted careful investigation. Should his suspicions ever prove accurate, Hunter read the names slowly, watching reactions ripple across the boardroom with each syllable. When he reached the very first name on that list, Connor Blake, the room seemed to collectively hold its breath, and Connor himself went rigid, his face draining of color beneath the composed mask he had maintained until that exact moment. Sebastian had written that Connor possessed both the access and the motive necessary to manipulate financial records undetected, citing specific patterns of behavior he found deeply troubling in retrospect, patterns he had observed but failed to act upon quickly enough. He expressed regret at not confronting the matter directly while he still had the chance, acknowledging that his own caution may have allowed something dangerous to continue unchecked for far longer than it should have. Toward the closing lines, Sebastian's tone shifted from investigative concern to something far more personal and urgent. He wrote directly to his daughter, though addressing her through Hunter rather than to her personally, explaining that whatever this letter revealed, Grace would need far more than financial compensation to navigate the crisis ahead. She would need truth, however painful, however inconvenient to the comfortable stability she might have assumed she inherited. The final line struck the room with particular force. Sebastian had written simply that Grace would need the truth far more urgently than she would ever need money. A statement that seemed almost prophetic given the exact scene now unfolding before everyone present. Grace stood frozen at the head of the table, her earlier composure completely dissolved, staring at Hunter as though seeing him, and perhaps her entire company, for the very first time with unclouded eyes. Connor attempted weakly to dismiss the letter as the confused ramblings of a dying man under enormous stress, his voice noticeably strained despite his effort to sound dismissive and unbothered. Nobody in the room appeared convinced by his protest, least of all Grace, who studied him now with an expression that had shifted rapidly from confusion toward something colder, sharper, and considerably more suspicious than anything she had shown throughout the entire meeting. Grace remained silent for a long stretch after the letter finished, her mind visibly working through implications she had never once considered before that afternoon. She had built her leadership around trust in the very executives her father had apparently begun to doubt in his final months, and the realization settled over her with the disorienting weight of a foundation suddenly discovered to be far less stable than she had believed. Connor, recovering some measure of composure, insisted loudly that the accusations were baseless, that Sebastian had grown increasingly paranoid toward the end of his life, prone to suspecting betrayal in places where none actually existed. He appealed directly to Grace, reminding her of his years of loyal service, his role in stabilizing the company during her difficult transition into leadership, hoping perhaps that gratitude might override the doubt now clearly forming in her expression. Jason Mercer, ever cautious, suggested a measured approach rather than immediate accusation, proposing that an internal audit be conducted quietly before any conclusions were drawn publicly. Grace agreed, though her tone made clear that this was not a gesture of trust toward Connor, but rather a methodical first step toward uncovering whatever truth her father had been unable to fully expose before his death interrupted his efforts. Aaron Lewis, head of the audit division, was summoned that same afternoon and given full authority to examine financial records dating back to the final year of Sebastian's life. He worked meticulously over the following days, cross-referencing investment accounts, transaction histories, and internal communications with a thoroughness that left no discrepancy unnoticed. What he discovered confirmed suspicions far more disturbing than anyone had initially anticipated. Several investment funds, once substantial and actively managed, had gradually been emptied through a series of transactions routed through intermediary accounts designed to obscure their ultimate destination. Records had been altered subtly enough to avoid casual detection, dates adjusted, figures rounded in ways that concealed steady, incremental losses accumulating over years rather than appearing as a single suspicious event. Electronic signatures on several critical documents, upon closer examination, showed inconsistencies suggesting forgery by someone with intimate knowledge of internal systems. Hunter worked alongside Aaron whenever permitted, drawing on his own memories of Sebastian's final months to help identify patterns the audit alone might have overlooked. Details he had dismissed as irrelevant 15 years earlier suddenly acquired new significance when placed alongside Aaron's findings, small inconsistencies in meeting schedules, minor changes in departmental authority, decisions that seemed insignificant individually, but formed a coherent pattern when properly assembled. Grace began spending long hours reviewing her father's private notes and correspondence, searching for anything that might illuminate what he had truly suspected before his death. She discovered fragments of concern scattered throughout seemingly mundane memos, references to financial irregularities phrased carefully enough to avoid direct accusation, evidence that Sebastian had indeed been building a case methodically, patiently, waiting for sufficient proof before confronting whoever threatened everything he had spent his life constructing. Slowly, painfully, Grace began to understand that her father had not left behind vague warnings out of confusion or paranoia, but rather a deliberate, carefully constructed safeguard, entrusted to the one person he believed would honor it faithfully regardless of personal cost. The realization arrived alongside a complicated mixture of grief and gratitude. Mourning a father she now understood far less completely than she had assumed, while recognizing the extraordinary loyalty of a man she had nearly dismissed entirely as an inconvenience. Late one evening, as Aaron Cross referenced yet another suspicious transaction, a dormant account buried deep within the company's international holdings suddenly showed activity for the first time in years, activation triggered by conditions none of them fully understood yet. The timing struck everyone present as far too coincidental to ignore, suggesting that someone, aware their scheme was finally unraveling, had begun taking desperate measures to protect whatever remained hidden. Connor Blake understood immediately that the walls were closing in around him, and rather than accept the consequences quietly, he chose instead to fight with every resource still available to him. He began working through trusted contacts within the technology department, attempting to quietly erase digital records before Aaron's audit could formally document them, hoping to eliminate evidence faster than the investigation could uncover it. His efforts proved only partially successful. Since Aaron had already secured backup copies of critical files the moment suspicious patterns first emerged, anticipating precisely this kind of desperate countermeasure. Still, Connor's attempts left digital fingerprints of their own, additional evidence of tampering that only strengthened the case building steadily against him. Evidence he had not intended to create, but could no longer avoid having produced. Simultaneously, Connor reached out to several individuals who had previously interacted with Hunter during his years at the firm, offering generous compensation in exchange for testimony questioning Hunter's character and reliability. Most declined outright, unwilling to participate in what clearly resembled an attempt to discredit an honest man, though a few wavered under the promise of substantial payment, creating additional complications that Grace and her legal team would eventually need to untangle carefully. Frustrated by the resistance he encountered internally, Connor turned toward public outlets, quietly arranging for damaging stories about Hunter to reach certain media contacts. Stories suggesting he had attempted to extort the company through manufactured accusations against a grieving family. The narrative spread quickly, painting Hunter as an opportunist rather than the loyal former employee he actually was, subjecting him to public scrutiny and harsh judgment from strangers who knew nothing of the actual circumstances. For the first time since this entire situation began unfolding, Grace made a deliberate public choice to defend Hunter directly rather than remain publicly neutral while internal investigations continued quietly. She released a brief, carefully worded statement affirming that the ongoing matter involved legitimate concerns raised by her late father, and that any suggestion Hunter had acted improperly was entirely without merit or supporting evidence. Margaret Hale, who had remained largely silent throughout the unfolding crisis, finally approached Grace privately one evening, carrying with her a collection of materials she had quietly preserved over many years. She produced Sebastian's private working journal, filled with handwritten observations documenting his growing concerns during his final months, alongside additional notes he had never formally shared with anyone else at the company, materials Margaret had kept safely hidden, precisely because she suspected someday they would matter. Grace read through the journal late into the night, discovering entries that confirmed and expanded upon everything the letter had already revealed. Her father had documented specific dates, specific meetings, specific concerns about financial discrepancies that aligned precisely with patterns Aaron's audit had independently uncovered through entirely separate methods. The convergence of evidence from multiple, completely independent sources left virtually no room remaining for reasonable doubt regarding what had actually transpired. As the pieces continued falling into place, Hunter found himself increasingly drawn back into the very corporate world he had deliberately abandoned years earlier. Though this time his involvement felt different, driven not by ambition, but by a quiet sense of obligation toward a promise he intended to see through completely. He worked alongside Aaron and Margaret late into successive evenings, organizing evidence methodically, ensuring that whatever came next would rest upon an unshakable foundation of documented, verifiable truth rather than mere accusation. By the end of that difficult week, the accumulated evidence had grown substantial enough that even Jason Mercer, initially cautious and reluctant to move against a senior colleague without absolute certainty, acknowledged privately to Grace that formal action against Connor now seemed not merely justified, but genuinely unavoidable, given everything they had uncovered together. As Hunter continued reviewing Sebastian's private journal alongside Margaret and Aaron, a far more disturbing pattern gradually began emerging beneath the surface of what they had already uncovered. The missing funds, substantial as they were, appeared to represent only a fraction of a much larger scheme, one aimed not merely at quiet financial theft, but at something considerably more ambitious and dangerous for the future of the entire company. Sebastian had apparently discovered that Connor was systematically maneuvering to transfer meaningful control of Whitmore Capital toward a coalition of foreign investors operating through a complex web of shell entities designed specifically to obscure their true ownership and ultimate intentions. Each diverted transaction had served two simultaneous purposes: enriching Connor personally while gradually weakening the company's financial position enough to make it vulnerable to acquisition on unfavorable terms that would benefit these outside interests. Had the scheme continued undetected through the completion of the international public offering, the resulting influx of capital, combined with the company's already compromised financial standing, would have created precisely the conditions necessary for these outside investors to acquire controlling influence. Effectively transferring an empire, Sebastian had spent decades building into hands entirely disconnected from the values and people who had helped create it. Grace absorbed this revelation with visible horror, understanding now that her father's caution regarding the public offering had never simply reflected typical business conservatism, but rather a specific, urgent awareness of the danger lurking within his own leadership team. Every delay he had insisted upon, every additional review he had demanded before finalizing major decisions, suddenly made perfect sense as deliberate efforts to buy time while he quietly searched for undeniable proof. The realization struck Grace with particular force regarding Hunter's role in this unfolding story. Her father had not simply entrusted him with sentimental keepsakes or vague warnings born of ordinary paranoia, but rather had deliberately positioned him as the final safeguard protecting the company's future, someone positioned outside the immediate reach of internal corruption, yet close enough to understand exactly how such corruption typically operated within organizations like theirs. She began to understand, gradually and with considerable emotional difficulty, that her father had anticipated the possibility he might not survive long enough to confront the threat personally, and had constructed an elaborate contingency specifically designed to activate only under precise circumstances that had indeed materialized exactly as he predicted so many years earlier. Hunter, for his part, felt the full weight of that responsibility settling over him more heavily than ever before, recognizing that he had unknowingly carried far greater significance for the company's future than he had ever imagined during those quiet years spent working modestly among archived paperwork. The envelope he had guarded faithfully was never merely a personal keepsake, but rather the final piece of a puzzle Sebastian had spent his last months carefully constructing. Margaret, watching Grace absorb this cascade of difficult truths, offered quiet reassurance that Sebastian had never doubted his daughter's capability to lead the company properly, only that he had feared she might not receive the necessary information in time to act decisively against threats operating within her own trusted circle. His plan, however unconventional, had ultimately succeeded precisely because he chose someone whose integrity he trusted absolutely over conventional institutional safeguards that had already proven vulnerable to manipulation. With the full scope of the scheme finally understood clearly by everyone involved, Grace recognized that decisive action could no longer wait for additional confirmation or further deliberation. The evidence assembled across financial records, personal journals, and independent testimony formed a complete and coherent picture, sufficient to bring the matter formally before the full board of directors for immediate and consequential resolution. The board convened an emergency session within days, gathering every senior executive and major shareholder into the same boardroom where Hunter had first opened Sebastian's letter only weeks earlier. The atmosphere carried none of the casual dismissiveness that had characterized that initial meeting, replaced instead by tense anticipation as word had already spread quietly regarding the seriousness of whatever revelations were about to be formally presented. Connor arrived prepared to fight, having assembled his own legal counsel and a prepared statement designed to discredit the mounting accusations before they could gain further traction among board members still uncertain how to interpret everything they had heard secondhand. He opened by characterizing the entire investigation as a coordinated attack orchestrated by a disgruntled former employee seeking financial gain through manufactured allegations against the company's most dedicated executive. Hunter rose calmly when invited to respond, carrying with him the physical evidence assembled over recent weeks, organized methodically into a presentation designed to leave no reasonable doubt regarding what had actually transpired. He began with Sebastian's original letter, reading key passages aloud once more for board members hearing them for the first time directly rather than through second-hand summary. He continued by presenting Margaret's carefully preserved journal entries, cross-referencing specific dates and observations against Aaron's independently conducted financial audit, demonstrating how patterns Sebastian had noticed years earlier aligned precisely with irregularities the audit team had subsequently confirmed through entirely separate analytical methods. The convergence between personal observation and financial documentation proved impossible for anyone present to dismiss as coincidental. Aaron himself then presented detailed findings regarding the diverted funds, walking board members through the specific transaction pathways used to obscure their ultimate destination, explaining how forged signatures had authorized transfers that senior executives believed represented legitimate business decisions. He demonstrated conclusively how these transactions connected directly to accounts controlled, whether directly or through intermediaries, by Connor personally. Margaret offered her own testimony regarding conversations she had witnessed between Sebastian and various executives during his final months, describing his growing unease regarding certain financial practices he had begun questioning more aggressively than usual. Her account, delivered with the quiet credibility of someone who had served the company faithfully for decades, carried considerable weight among board members who had known and respected her tenure. As the presentation continued building toward its conclusion, Connor's composure began deteriorating visibly, his earlier confident denials giving way to increasingly defensive, contradictory statements that undermined his own credibility further with each attempt at explanation. When pressed directly regarding specific transactions bearing his authorization, he offered explanations that conflicted with documentation presented only minutes earlier, creating inconsistencies that board members could not help but notice. Jason Mercer, speaking with the measured authority of someone who had initially resisted drawing hasty conclusions, confirmed that the legal team had independently reviewed all presented evidence and found it substantial enough to warrant immediate formal action rather than further deliberation. His endorsement carried particular weight precisely because everyone present understood how reluctant he had been throughout the process to move against a longtime colleague without absolute certainty. Following extensive discussion, the board voted unanimously to freeze all accounts under Connor's direct authority pending formal investigation by external regulatory authorities, while simultaneously suspending him from all executive responsibilities effective immediately. Aaron's audit team was granted expanded authority to trace every remaining diverted transaction, ensuring complete accountability for funds that had been systematically stolen from the company over an extended period spanning several years. Within days, formal charges were filed against Connor Blake, and law enforcement authorities took him into custody following a thorough review of the evidence Aaron's team had painstakingly assembled. The scandal that followed dominated financial news coverage for weeks, though the narrative had shifted entirely from the false accusations once directed at Hunter toward the genuine corruption that had nearly destroyed the company from within. Grace requested a private meeting with Hunter shortly after the formal proceedings concluded, choosing a quiet conference room rather than the imposing boardroom where their initial confrontation had taken place. She began by offering a sincere, unguarded apology, acknowledging that she had misjudged him completely during their first encounter, dismissing him as an inconvenience rather than recognizing him as the loyal guardian her father had carefully chosen him to be. She confessed openly that she had never fully understood the depth of trust her father placed in Hunter, admitting that discovering this hidden dimension of her father's final months had forced her to reconsider much of what she believed she knew about him. The revelation, though painful, had ultimately deepened her respect for both men rather than diminishing it. Understanding now the extraordinary lengths Sebastian had gone to protect a company he clearly loved more than she had previously appreciated. Grace then offered Hunter a formal position within the company, proposing he accept the role of vice president alongside substantial equity ownership and considerable financial compensation befitting someone who had ultimately saved the entire organization from catastrophic collapse. She emphasized that the offer reflected genuine gratitude rather than mere obligation, hoping he might consider rejoining the world he had once walked away from under such difficult circumstances. Hunter listened respectfully before declining the formal position, explaining that his motivations throughout this entire ordeal had never been rooted in ambition or a desire to reclaim his former career. He suggested instead a more limited arrangement, agreeing to serve temporarily as an independent advisor throughout the company's necessary restructuring period, offering his expertise without seeking permanent authority or ongoing involvement in daily operations. When Grace pressed him gently regarding his reasoning, curious why he would refuse such generous compensation after everything he had endured, Hunter explained quietly that what her father had entrusted to him all those years ago had never felt like an assignment or a transaction. It had felt instead like a promise, something sacred that carried meaning precisely because it demanded nothing in return beyond simple faithfulness to its purpose. Grace absorbed his words carefully, recognizing in them an echo of the same integrity her father had apparently valued so highly during those quiet years working alongside him. She decided, after considerable reflection, to preserve the original letter within her family's private security vault rather than filing it away among ordinary corporate records, treating it instead as a meaningful piece of her father's legacy deserving careful, permanent protection. As their conversation drew toward its conclusion, Grace glanced once more toward the check that remained untouched on the table between them, the very same amount she had originally offered in exchange for silence weeks earlier. Hunter made no move to claim it, and Grace, understanding fully now what that refusal represented, made no further attempt to press the matter, recognizing that some things simply could not be purchased regardless of the sum offered. In the months that followed, Whitmore Capital released the full findings of its investigation, restoring shareholder confidence that had nearly collapsed under hidden corruption. Grace overhauled the internal oversight system so no single executive could ever again operate beyond scrutiny. Hunter returned to his quiet life, accepting only occasional advisory work rather than any permanent position of power. Later, Grace found a small handwritten line on the back of the original envelope, added by her father years earlier, saying that if she ever read that letter together with Hunter, she had chosen truth over power, and only then would the company truly belong to her. The story closed with Hunter walking away in his same worn coat, the untouched check left behind on that table, never signed, a quiet reminder that certain values cannot be bought.